Alignment with God doesn't usually begin with dramatic moments. Alignment with God begins with the courage to respond to the small promptings that we might otherwise overlook. Hello, my friends. Come on in. Get comfortable. I'm so glad you're here. If you're a steady listener, welcome back. And if this is your first time joining me, I'm especially glad you found your way here. I'm Lucianne, and this is a space where we slow down the rhythm of our day and we have honest conversations about what's happening in our real life and how our faith meets us right in the middle of it. And most importantly, it's a place where we remember that God is present with us in every part of our journey. There's no pressure here, no pretending, just genuine conversation. So if you can, pull up a chair, grab a cup of coffee or tea, and let's lean into today's conversation together. I've been thinking about something recently, something that doesn't always come up in our everyday conversations. What does it actually look like to live in alignment with God? It's one of those questions we may think about, but we very rarely talk out loud about. Honestly, when was the last time you took a walk with one of your girlfriends or sat across the table over coffee and you talked about that? Now, I would imagine probably not recently. And yet, it's actually a very important part of our walk with God. Because when we hear that phrase, alignment with God, it can sound a little, well, too spiritual or maybe even a bit dramatic. But in my experience, alignment with God rarely begins that way. It's definitely not too spiritual and it's not dramatic. Most of the time, it begins with something very small. I like to think about it this way. A simple, seemingly insignificant act of obedience can awaken awareness to what God is doing in our lives. I actually can recall one of those moments when that happened in my life. Now, I'm going back many years ago. At the time, I was single. I was working full time as a pilot, running my own business. My life was very full. My two children were in college. My day to day life was busy. And I'm sure you all can relate to what that's like. But during that season, I began to notice something unusual happening within me. I recognized a thought that kept running through my mind. It was the thought that I should open my home for a small gathering, a place where people could come and worship together. Now, at the time, that wasn't something that was on my radar. Most of my energy was already being spent managing everything else that was already on my plate. And besides, I had never led anything like that before. But the idea kept returning. It was persistent. And to be honest, I didn't know what to do with that thought at first. But the sense that this was something I was being invited to step into didn't go away. Even though I couldn't fully understand it, I took a step of faith. I simply said, okay, I'll do it. I had no idea what that yes would entail. But the first step was simple. Just open my home. So I did. What I didn't have a clue about at the time was that this seemingly small act of obedience would become the beginning of something that would shape my spiritual journey forevermore. Those gatherings were centered around worship. We would spend time singing, praying, simply focusing our attention on God. And I became aware of something interesting that began to happen. As I intentionally slowed down every week and made space to focus on God during these meetings, I noticed something changing within me. My mind became clearer, my nervous system settled. The usual noise of everyday life didn't seem so loud anymore. And in that space, I became aware of something new happening. I began sensing small promptings. Sometimes it was a thought to pray for someone. Other times it was a scripture that came to mind. Or sometimes a sense to ask a simple question. And at first, I didn't know what to do with any of those impressions. I wasn't even sure where they were coming from. But one thing did become clear. Those promptings didn't feel like ordinary thoughts. They were persistent. I remember a particular evening during one of those gatherings very clearly. The room was quiet, except for the music playing softly in the background. People were scattered all around my living room. Some were sitting on the couch, others on the floor, some were standing. We were just worshiping. And as I sat there singing very quietly, a thought kept returning to my mind. A thought to pray for someone who was sitting across the room. At first, I brushed it off, but the impression didn't leave. It stayed there until eventually I walked over and said, "Can I pray for you?" And what followed made it very clear that something deeper had just happened. And in that moment, my eyes were open to something I had never fully understood before. And it was this: God really does speak to his people. And often it's in very simple ways. And over time, a verse from scripture began making much more sense to me. It was when Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me." Now, for many years, I had read those words, but during that season, I began to recognize what that meant in real life. Looking back now, I can see how God was teaching me what it meant to live in alignment with Him. And interesting enough, the first sign that alignment was forming within me wasn't certainty. Actually, it was courage. The courage to act on what I was sensing. Was I nervous to step out on what I was sensing? Absolutely. But isn't it true that any time we step into something unfamiliar, there's always a little uncertainty trying to hold us back? But something else was present too: curiosity. I found myself wondering, could this actually be God speaking to me? And that curiosity made me willing to take the next step, to go ahead and pray for someone, to share that scripture, to ask the question. And in each time that I responded to those promptings and I took action, my confidence It didn't come from knowing exactly what would happen. It came from recognizing that God was present in those moments. And little by little, that courage began to grow. There was something else that I learned during those gatherings. It wasn't just me noticing those promptings. Other people in the room, they began experiencing similar things too. Someone would feel led to pray for someone else. Another person would share scripture that had been on their heart. Someone else would pick up a guitar and just begin playing. And slowly, something became very noticeable. God wasn't just speaking to a few people in the room. He was speaking to all of us. And as people began sharing what they were sensing, it created permission for others to do the same. That's when something simple but very important began to settle into my heart. It was this truth: God desires to speak to his children, and he often does so more than we realize. And given my religious background, this was definitely new territory for me. But moment by moment, trusting God became something I relied on. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever had a moment when a thought kept returning over and over to your mind? Perhaps a quiet sense to pray for someone, or an impression to reach out and encourage someone, yet you couldn't quite explain why that thought stayed with you until you acted on it? What if those moments aren't random or coincidences? What if those quiet impressions are the way God is guiding you? Alignment with God doesn't usually begin with dramatic moments. Alignment with God begins with the courage to respond to the small promptings that we might otherwise overlook. It wasn't long before I realized a significant change in my life was happening. As I started trusting that God truly desires to be present, to lead, guide, and direct his children, I noticed something new growing within me. And there it was again, curiosity. A quiet curiosity to become more aware of God throughout my day. Not just during prayer, not just during worship, but in the ordinary moments of my everyday life. Sometimes that awareness appeared during a short pause in the middle of a busy day. Sometimes it happened while I was driving down the road. And other times, it showed up in the most unexpected places. Like while I was standing at the kitchen sink doing the dishes, or while I was folding laundry. What I discovered is this: as our awareness of God grows, his presence becomes easier to notice. And it's not because he suddenly just appears, but rather because we begin to recognize that he has always been near all along. And alignment with him, it often grows through small moments when we slow down, take notice, and have the courage to respond. And with that, this feels like a great place to let this conversation rest for today. My friend, as you head back into the routine of your day, remember this: you are chosen, you are loved, you are amazing by design. If you like to keep having conversations like this, You're always welcome to join me here each week. And if you feel led to explore this work more deeply, you'll find a link to connect in the show notes. Love ya. Bye for now.